Distinguished panelists and dear participants, very good afternoon. We welcome to the joint webinar of Institute of China Studies, Malaya University and NIICE on the topic Geopolitical Rivalry in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. China Studies is one of a major research center, not only because it's our major neighbor, but also because of the rise of China globally. In China Studies, as a whole, we bring into perspective the rising powers, mounting economic, military, and diplomatic cloud that certainly has an aptitude to either overturn or sustain the current contemporary world order. The center broadly examines China's international strategic thinking and conduct, foreign policy and security policy, and the impact of domestic politics and economy on China's foreign relations. It further addresses China's emergence in the face of the world in flux, domestic politics, economy, society and culture, People's Liberation Army, and Tibet Autonomous Region, and most importantly, China's engagement with each of South Asian countries. To talk on this interesting topic today, we have very distinguished scholars from Asia. We have Dr. Negeo Taubin, who is the Director of Institute of China Studies, University of Malaya in Malaysia. We also have Dr. Rombei C. Banloy, who is the President of the Philippines Association for China Studies. And we have two scholars from our region, Surabna Barua, who is a Research Associate with NIICE, and Dr. Munis Bang, who is a Visiting Fellow with NIICE. Today we will not spend more time reading the profile because it is available on the website. So we'll just directly go to the presentations. But before we start, maybe we can also request Dr. Taubin to briefly talk about Institute of China Studies, University of Malaya, and then make his presentation, which will be followed by Dr. Banloy, and then Surabna, and then Monish. There'll be questions and answer round after the discussion. So we request all our participants and people on Facebook Live to drop their questions at the chat box and the comment box. I will make sure that it reaches to the concerned presenter. Dr. Taubin, maybe would you like to start first?
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Primot, for having me at this webinar today. First of all, I would just like to thank your institute, NIICE, right? It's a very nice name, Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement, for inviting the Institute of China Studies at Eastern Malaya to be a partner in this program. I think actually most of the work is on your side, and we just play a supportive role. But we are very honored and proud to be here. And my name is Dr. Niao Chaobing. I'm the director of this institute, and the institute is basically the only China-focused institute in Malaysian universities. We of course research on China's politics, foreign policy, economy, especially as it pertains to relationship with Southeast Asia and particularly, of course, Malaysia. And therefore, China-Southeast Asia relations is one of the areas that I am interested in, and it's really the major story at the moment regarding the emergence of China as, of course, the next so-called superpower. But at the same time, the established power, the United States, of course, still here, is still powerful, still making a lot of impact, and the relationship between the two giants are actually undergoing a very profound stage of rivalry at the moment. I think it's really, really good that we got this opportunity to compare the experience in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the two regions where big power rivalry is happening at the very moment. And in both regions, Malaysia and Nepal are relatively small players, watching carefully how the big powers play out their interactions. But first of all, let me give some observations, offer some of my own observations. I think indeed we are experiencing a profound change of the regional order that has basically has been established in the post Second World War period. It is unfolding right before our eyes, and we don't know where it will go. Basically, this is an order, a regional order built after the Second World War. From the very beginning, it covered only the maritime part of Southeast Asia, basically Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, the maritime parts, the Thailand, and the continental parts of Southeast Asia, the Indo-Chinese part, was not brought into this regional order, but it was later only joined into this order. This regional order is something that all Southeast Asians basically are familiar with, have grown up with, and some of them have become quite comfortable in this regional order. And what does this what would be the characteristics of this order? I think there first I will list out some features of it. I think first of all, it is a political community manifested in ASEAN, in the multilateral organization of ASEAN, with a set of principles. We all heard of this ASEAN way, the non-interference principle, and so on and so forth. Some of the ASEAN principles are quite well written, clearly recognizable, but some of it is actually more like a norms, ASEAN norms that is not well written. But people accumulate the experiences of working with this ASEAN. And this order is basically very stability first, status quo, and conservative. Conservative not in the sense of political ideology, conservative in the sense of very risk averse grouping. It is right. Compare, I think, in the international organization literature to EU, but I think it's a very different organization. ASEAN never aspired to the kind of community that EU would first begin with, right? So, but ASEAN is actually more a very status quo, very slow moving kind of thing. That is exactly the order that it wanted to build. And this order is actually but ASEAN basically always say that it's not aligned, it doesn't want to choose, but basically it is a very comfortable, it's more or less built in part on the basis of a US-led order. I think this is a recognition from, because it's from the maritime part of Southeast Asia where it began, it only later expanded to the continental part, right? So it's actually very comfortable with the US-led order, even though it doesn't always follow US leadership, but you can see most of the members are more US aligned compared to aligning with other countries, right? And the other characteristic is that it always has the thinking or the strategy of engaging with all the big powers, and doesn't, but this is something I said before, doesn't want to choose and doesn't want to leave out others. You always want to strive for inclusivity, right? And finally, I think it is a very slow pace, elite driven community building project. Therefore, I think even after so many decades, it's still something that is relatively confined to the elite level, to the policymakers, to academics, think tankers, but sometimes the business community. But actually, for the ordinary citizens, they still feel a little bit distant from the whole ASEAN project. Now, this is basically the Southeast Asian order anchor upon ASEAN, the organization, but you have the fundamental underpinning of it is a US-led order. And this order has experienced great power rivalries in the decades that since it was established. The first is the US China rivalry back in the 50s and 60s, when China under Mao Zedong was at least perceived as an expansionist communist power, encouraging the communist movements in Southeast Asia, providing moral support and sometimes even material support, right? And therefore, this order, the maritime part of it was very much with the Western camp. the anti-communist camp. That is the 50s and 60s. But interestingly, in the 70s and 80s, we experienced the so-called Second Cold War in Southeast Asia, in which China became a partner of ASEAN, containing the communist expansion, not from China, but from Vietnam, from the Indo-Chinese part, right? And there was therefore another case of Sino-Soviet, another case of big power rivalry, and this time being played out between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in the 70s and 80s. And again, ASEAN was not a particularly neutral organization, in the sense that the strategic preference was clear. It was more anti-Vietnam and therefore more resistance toward the Soviet part of it. And if you understand this background, is the sense that ASEAN always want to engage, doesn't want to choose, but during the period of strategic confrontation, it did make some choices in the past, right? But after the end of the Cold War, I think the idea of big power rivalry was temporarily absent until the re-emergence of US-China rivalry in recent years. But there was this absence of big power rivalry that allowed ASEAN to build up its credentials as a regional organization that is a friend to all, welcome all, and we want to include all. China built excellent relationship with ASEAN during that time. Is I think perhaps the most active dialogue partners, of course, together with other like Japan or Korea. But unfortunately, US did not pay much attention to ASEAN, to be frank. It was not a very active partner, a dialogue partner compared to China. And if you look at the functional cooperation between China, there are a lot of those, right? But the re-emergence of this US-China rivalry bring difficulties back to ASEAN. ASEAN has been comfortable with a US-led order that did not have to make choices like during the Cold War for many, many years already, for at least the 2 decades after the end of Cold War. Now we are actually back to this picture, and the current generation of leaders, if you look at all ASEAN leaders, I think they would rather not want to make any big choices, these big geopolitical questions, right? I think the leaders that grew up, that experienced the Cold War, can instinctively feel or instinctively know how to make some difficult choices. But this generation of leaders basically are very comfortable with the way that it was before the US-China rivalry began to unfold. So the kind of uncertainties, the kinds of risk, and the kinds of unpreparedness, I think caught a lot of these ASEAN leaders as surprise. And many of them are basically, I don't think, very well prepared to face this situation and make the best policies decisions at the moment. And the competition between the US and China basically is played out along many, many fronts, from geopolitics to economics, even to ideology and culture. And I hope that it doesn't extend to other areas, but basically it's along many fronts. And right now we are witnessing the competition between two major geopolitical / geo-economic constructs facing the region. One is the so-called Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy endorsed by the United States and its partners, basically the Quad. And China, on the other hand, came up with this BRI, the Belt and Road Initiatives. The pandemic that we experience right now, I think basically accelerates the rivalry, intensifies the competitions, and these are not going away. So facing these uncertainties of the present situation, and of course we have the very strange or interesting presidency of Donald Trump in the United States, I think in a way also make the situation more difficult, because it increased the uncertainty and unreliability of the United States to be a regional leading country at the moment, right? We grew up basically comfortable with the US-led order, but the US at the moment is perhaps the most unstable factor, right? President Trump is very unpredictable, and he has done a lot more strategic damages, like the withdrawing from the TPP and other initiatives, right? That basically undercuts the credibility of the United States. But on the other hand, China is still not widely trusted in this region. There are still a lot of skepticisms about the intention of China. The US, like it or hate it, is at least a familiar hegemon, so to speak, right? But China is an unknown factor. I think that is the part that why a lot of the policy elites in the region, they like to continue to engage China, but they always like the US as a balancing balancing factor in the region. But the US is not behaving that it should be, right? So I I think I have to quickly conclude. I think I have just basically provide some parameters of developments, but let me kind of finish on some different scenarios. I think the US-China competition, they could have produced different possibilities. First is a effect that actually it would make ASEAN much more coherent, that every ASEAN country realize it's time for us to stick to each other, not rely on any of the two big powers, but rather just we have to help out each other and make ASEAN much more coherent and more centered to the life of the Southeast Asians, and to speed up the development of the community of ASEAN. So it will have a coherent effects, the US-China rivalry. The second is the opposite. It's polarizing in a sense that ASEAN may be hollowed out, which is the self-help tendencies of the member states will basically make them align more to one of the big powers against the other, right? And in this case, ASEAN will still be there, but it will be hollowed out in the sense that it will not be able to increasingly act in one voice, right? And the third, which is an unthinkable scenario, which is an extension of the second scenario, but I think there are too many black swan events, so-called swan events, like the Trump presidency in the world politics in the last couple of years, that policy makers should start to think and even prepare for the unthinkable. And the third scenario, I'm just speculating here, is that down the road, is ASEAN going to survive the breakup of ASEAN? If the US-China intensifies, the rivalry intensifies to a point where breaking up of ASEAN become a possibility, right? I think of course, this is not a word that we want to see, but I just thought that this might be a possibility for policy thinkers to think about. All right, I think I have spoken for about 10 to 15 minutes. That is the time that is allocated to me. So I'm happy to answer any questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nego Taubin. The next speaker for today is Dr. Romel C. Banloy. You also have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, NIICE, for involving the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies in this very important online conversation. The Philippine Association for Chinese Studies is a professional association of individuals interested in promoting greater understanding between China and the Philippines and the study of China and the Chinese. We were established in 1987, and in fact, our founding president is attending the webinar now, Dr. Teresa Carino. So thank you very much for this kind of invitation. What I would like to discuss now is to describe the role of the Philippines in this growing geopolitical rivalry between the Philippines and China, between China and the United States, particularly in the context of the South China Sea disputes. And if you observe now, security tensions in the South China Sea are rising again due to escalating major power rivalry between the United States and China. The US and China have increased their military presence in the South China Sea by sending their warship to conduct air-sea battle exercises while the whole world continues to struggle against the scourge of COVID-19 pandemic. Just recently, two American aircraft carriers, the USS Nimitz and the USS Ronald Reagan, started its military drills in the South China Sea last Sunday, July 4, just coinciding with the commemoration of American Independence Day. The US government regards those exercises as part of its commitment of standing up for the right of all nations to fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows. China, on the other hand, just concluded a day following that, last July 5, its military exercise near the Mars Island. The objective of China in conducting these military drills is to counter the US and to push back against Pentagon for having ulterior motives in sending two aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. So you will see that the tensions between the two major powers are heating up in the South China Sea as both up the ante of its military activities in the contested maritime domain that is considered to be one of the major flashpoints of armed conflicts in Asia, where the two major powers can collide. Of course, we can also include the issue of Taiwan and the issue of the Korean Peninsula. In fact, those military exercises were so proximate, making US Rear Admiral James Kirk on the Nimitz, USS Nimitz to comment that they have seen each other almost face to face. And if you will notice that prior to these military exercises, the Philippine government, through part of Foreign Affairs, issued a strong statement last Friday, I think, last July 3, expressing concerns over China's military drills in the South China Sea. And our Secretary of Foreign Affairs stressed that the Philippines would severely respond if China would encroach on Philippine territories. And I quote, Locsin exclaimed, should the exercises spill over to Philippine territory, then China is forewarned that it will be met with vigorous response, diplomatic, and whatever else is appropriate. Fortunately, China concluded its military drills without untoward incidents, so that is good for the region. However, the growing major power rivalry between China and the US in the South China Sea has raised a big question if the Philippines is pushing back against China and is shifting back to the US as its only military ally, considering that recently Manila just suspended the termination of the visiting agreement. So how will this new situation affect Philippines' comprehensive strategic cooperation with China? Is President Duterte flip-flopping again in his foreign policy amidst US-China rivalry in the South China Sea? This is my explanation. Some are to conclude that Duterte is flip-flopping in the guise of pursuing an independent foreign policy. But my argument is that the Philippine government is just applying the grand strategies of small states in dealing with great powers within an anarchic international system. Small states and great powers have different survival instincts amidst international anarchy. Realist theory of international relations contends that great powers seek survival by balancing each other. But small states, by virtue of their inherent vulnerability in the anarchic international system, find their survival by forging relevant relationship with great powers, either by balancing each other or through bandwagoning or through small states respond to situations according to their national interest and interest of the major in competition. The Philippine government is pushing back against China in the South China Sea because of the current situation that threatens Manila's security interests, particularly in the West Philippine Sea. China's recent military activities in the South China Sea, particularly around the Kalayaan Island group in the Spratlys, are causing serious security anxieties in the Philippines. There's a tendency for the Philippine government to cling with the United States to address common security interests, as the US continues to be the only security ally of the Philippines that can effectively balance China. So this is the situation of the Philippines. When our security interest is threatened in the South China Sea, we have a tendency to ship our gear back to the United States. But the Philippine government has economic needs that China can provide. So the Philippines also has this great interest to pursue comprehensive strategic cooperation with China for pragmatic economic purposes. If China can allay Manila's current fear of the situation in the West Philippine Sea and can provide Manila's current security needs in the Spratlys, then the Philippines will find no reason to reach out with its only security ally, the United States, as this alliance always reminds the Philippines of its colonial experiences. But the Philippine government is compelled to pivot back to the US because of the current situation in the South China Sea. The current situation now dictates the Philippines to go back to the United States again under its security umbrella in Southeast Asia. And if you will notice in the history of Philippine relationship with China and the United States, our relationship with China in the United States has always been a relationship of relating with China and relating with the United States, relating with China because of our centuries-old friendship and geographic proximity, and relating with the United States because of our common political values and common experiences. But we also pursue the policy of distancing from these two major powers if our interest dictates so. For example, in 1991, the Philippine government terminated the US-Philippines military bases agreement because of the post-Cold War situation. There was a view at the time that the post-Cold War security situation rendered the presence of American troops in the Philippines obsolete. But when China established full control of the mischief reef in 1995, the Philippines invited the US back by signing the Visiting Forces Agreement that came into force in 1999. And the BFA became very useful in the aftermath of 9/11 countries cooperating in the global war against terrorism. Meanwhile, the South China Sea enjoyed a calm moment in 2002 when China and members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations signed the Declaration of the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. But when the Philippine government withdrew its troops from Iraq in 2004, the US became lukewarm to the Philippines, encouraging Manila to pursue comprehensive engagement with China. In fact, in 2005, the Philippines and China enjoyed the golden years of their bilateral ties, and this greatly dismayed the United States. However, in 2009, the situation went wrong again in the South China Sea. China became more assertive legally and militarily that renewed security tensions in the South China Sea. Legally, China submitted to the United Nations its controversial non-dash line claim in the South China Sea, and militarily, China fortified its military actors, occupied areas in and also in the Paracel. And this situation encouraged the Philippines to deal with the United States again because we are threatened by the prevailing situation at that time. And the situation get worse when China occupied Scarborough Shoal in 2012. Okay? And as a result of that, the Philippines filed an arbitration case against China in 2013. And you know the arbitration case severely embarrassed China. And this situation led to the rapid deterioration of Philippines-China relationship and the blossoming again of Philippine-American relationship. Okay? However, the arbitration case motivated China to pursue land reclamation activities, which led to the building of artificial islands in 7 geographic features belonging with the West Philippine Sea of the Philippines or around the Kalayaan Island group of the Philippines. And under this situation, the Philippine government signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with the United States in 2014. However, the situation changed again in 2016. The International Tribunal made its landmark decision in favor of the Philippines, and the Philippines under Duterte, who had personal animosity against the United States, decided to pursue a paradigm shift to China. And as a result, the Philippines and China have started to enjoy a new era of closer friendship under Duterte, who described his relationship with China like the blooming of a big and beautiful flower. Duterte's policy of paradigm shift to China ushered in a new age of cooperation between the two countries. Duterte even threatened to separate with the United States. And when President Xi Jinping visited the Philippines in 2018, the two countries declared their comprehensive strategic cooperation to have an all-around relationship, which is in fact, I considered a rapid turnaround in their overall bilateral relationship. So they celebrated again their golden age of bilateral ties. As a result, Philippines and China signed the Memorandum of Agreement to facilitate their joint cooperation on the development of oil and gas resources in the South China Sea, particularly in areas being claimed by the Philippines called the West Philippine Sea. So situation were going very well in Philippines-China relations. Philippines and China even created this very important bilateral mechanism called the Bilateral Consultative Mechanism in the South China Sea in order to promote peace, friendship, and cooperation in the South China Sea. Yeah. But the COVID-19 pandemic altered the security situation in the South China Sea. As a result of China's continuing assertion of sovereignty in the South China Sea. And because of that, okay, can you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. As a result of that, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw China's increasing assertion of its sovereignty in the South China Sea. And the Philippines and its neighbors have also expressed their security anxieties on this current situation. And as a result of this current situation, the Philippine government needs to pivot back to the United States. In other words, the situation in the South China Sea greatly affects Philippine foreign policy towards China and the United States. When the security situation is tense in the South China Sea, the Philippines has a tendency to embrace the United States. However, when the security situation is calm, the Philippines is in fact engaging China. And I call this kind of situation as Philippines' application of a grand strategy of small states when dealing with major powers. That's all, and I'm ready to receive any questions or reactions during the open forum. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Romel C. Banloy. Let's move to the third speaker for today. The third speaker for today is Surabna Barua. You also have 15 minutes. Surabna, please unmute yourself. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal, for this opportunity. It was great listening to my two co-panelists. And on a lighter note, I can see two books out of the many behind Dr. Romel. One says China and one says Great Power. So interestingly, that is going to be the focus area of today's talk. So geopolitical rivalry is something, unfortunately, has been a debated topic. It's evergreen, it's always topical. And I think the word great game was very much popularized when Rudling used it to explain the uh, uh, geopower political rivalry between the British and the Russian empires. And coming to the focus area of South and Southeast Asia for this webinar, more recently, Bertil Lintner wrote a book about Great Game East. So we are always talking about great games being played out in every nook and corner of the world. And I think this entire topic is very based on, like the first speaker mentioned, is based on a realistic understanding of international relations, which is very, very relevant even today. As we move on to understand what these great games can be, some my co-panelists have spoken about the area of South China Sea, Philippines, Malaysia. I will try and focus a little towards some of the countries of South Asia and and the bridge between South and Southeast Asia, a little about Myanmar also. So as we have noted that this great game, the shift of this great game started, the focus of this great game had started shifting towards the Asia Pacific that we now call the Indo-Pacific. And from the transatlantic, the move had already started taking place with the rise of China, of India, and the many rising and emerging powers in the region today. And mind you, these words big powers, great powers, whether it's major powers, whether it's superpower, these are all different terminologies in international relations. So even though we may agree that China is a rising, emerging, and in fact even a great power, I think it's too early to call it a superpower, which is a position still held by the United States. In fact, in a mere chimerian idea, we can say that US would have lost its dominance as the regional hegemon in this area, which is exactly what China is trying to do, push US away from this area, at least as a regional hegemon. But to become a superpower, I think China would need a little more than what it already has, whether it's in terms of military prowess, whether it's in terms of technology, and many other things that we can debate on. The point being that China is still simply making its way only to a great power, not really a superpower. And that is where I think US is trying to come in and stop China from being or pushing US also from the position of that superpower. And in doing so, China and US definitely has collided over many aspects of international relations. And in fact, the term that we are using, Indo-Pacific, itself was insisted upon by President Trump. And we know that that is because he wanted to, many scholars already have spoken about it, he wanted to bring the focus a little towards his ally, India, and say that this is a region where China is not the only country that is rising and emerging. India is also there on the forefront. Hence, a Indo-Pacific region, which is going to be dominated by US and its allies, whether we look at the Quad or anything else. But in my presentation for the next 10 minutes, probably I'm just going to elaborate on 2 points of this great game that we are talking about. Firstly, the logic of the great game definitely has changed in this century over the last. During the Cold War, we saw the two powers at that point of time, USA and USSR. They had created power blocks, and they were pretty clear-cut blocks. Some of the countries definitely led by India and other countries were non-aligned, but yet there were very much clear-cut blocks based on ideological grounds of communism and capitalism. However, today I think that logic of the game has changed with globalization creating various interlinkages. Though there is an attempt to create those power blocks, I think those clear-cut lines are not very possible. US is trying to do that. In fact, if we look at China's BRI, the big project that is helping it make its ways into the global scenario, is also being countered by something, say for example, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor led by China, backed by Japan and the US. But those clear-cut blocks might not be very possible. At the economic level, you see that there are various supply chains. The product may be manufactured in India, but a chip may be coming from somewhere else, some part may be coming from South Korea, and so on and so forth. Similarly, at a political level, each country is affiliated with the other through multilateral groupings, even at a sub-regional level. So though the game is still similar, but the logic of the game has definitely changed in this century. The second point that I would like to note regarding this great game again is the fact that the mode of the game also has changed. And I think we will all agree, not just because Joseph NIICE spoke about soft power, which then promoted itself to smart power. But it is a given that hard power, or whether they're nuclear weapons or ships and missiles, only they help you get a tactical advantage, but that's not the only way that you can fight or at least compete in a geopolitical scenario. I would argue that the mode of this game has now moved to development and infrastructure diplomacy. It is through these investments, at least, that China is emerging as the regional hegemon in the region, in South and Southeast Asia, and even beyond towards Africa and Latin America. So infrastructure is a major area where I think if we are to compete with, if we are to play a great game, countries, big powers, players, great powers and emerging powers will have to focus on. Just coming to a couple of examples in South and Southeast Asia, we will start with one of our host institutions, NIICE, Nepal. So when you look at Nepal, we realize that Nepal has had a very good relationship with, until recently, with both India and China. And China has done well to sort of sort out its boundary disputes, create highways and networks across its border towards Nepal, where India has faltered more recently, whether it was the blockade or whether it was the recent, the Lipu Lake area dispute that emerged, which has now become a big bone of contention between India and Nepal. So I would say when it comes to power rivalry in Nepal, India has, what it has lacked is to focus on providing that sort of the networks and connectivity linkages which China has provided to Nepal, beyond a lot of other things as well. What we also noticed a few years back, the fact that India voted for Afghanistan to be a part of SAARC. It was Nepal and a few other countries which pushed for China also to be a member of the SAARC, which then later became an observer member. So it shows that the balance of this power rivalry is tipping towards China, at least in Nepal. Moving on to say Sri Lanka, when we look at Sri Lanka, it has been clear it's an epic case of, we've been studying it as an epic case of debt trap diplomacy, and how China has become one of the biggest lenders, which earlier it was not. Back in 2008, in fact, only 2% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt was Chinese, and later that changed to about 10% within a very short span of time. And of course, the port of Hambantota being the case in point, where China really converted a debt contract into an equity contract, then gaining the 99-year-old lease. So Sri Lanka, again, is a playground for China, if I can say so, where it has invested in infrastructure, whether it's airport, whether it's deep sea port, or whether it's a port in Hambantota, or so and so forth. India, on the other hand, has managed to make a few housing projects and a few infrastructure projects here and there, but it has not been able to match up to China to that extent. But since Sri Lanka is a very big major country, in fact, when in the mid-2000s we spoke about the string of pearls theory that became a warning for India. That actually was based on these ports, Gwadar port, whether it's the Hambantota port, or even the Chokpu port in Myanmar, and even in Bangladesh. So these are important countries, undoubtedly. And again, I would bring up Burton Lintner again, because he wrote another book recently last year, which talks about these smaller island countries in the Indian Ocean being the costliest pearls of China, meaning that these are strategic hinge points for China that any counterparty would have to consider as major strategic points to focus on. If we move to Myanmar, we notice that China has had a big influence in Myanmar for many, many decades. After the 1988-89 coup and the Tiananmen Square incident and the 8888 incident in Myanmar. So these incidences particularly brought China and Myanmar together, after which we see that multiple connectivity projects have been built by China in Myanmar. The most important, like I mentioned, being the Chokpu Deep Sea Port, which is then trying to connect China to the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal. It already has a gas and oil pipeline. Railway lines are being built through Myanmar cutting across the entire country. So definitely infrastructure again is a big point of interest for China. And India, in fact, today morning there was an article in the Economic Times and elsewhere that the Kaladan multimodal project is going to be expedited by Myanmar, which was sort of a clear indication that Myanmar is also taking steps to not be allowed to be taken over by China in terms of its infrastructure. It's trying to bring in other powers, bring in other players of this great game, including Japan, including Thailand, Singapore, and other countries. If we go to Maldives, Maldives is one example where India and China particularly have been, there is a clear political divide when it comes to domestic concerns as well. Either there is a pro-democracy, a pro-China leader or a pro-India leader, and that has been evident. And depending on who is in power, the balance of power tilts either towards India or towards China. I think I will just wind up. There are various examples that can be pointed out. Uh, One that I would like to again talk about is Japan, for example, besides the US and the Quad, because we've already spoken, my previous panelists have already spoken about US and Quad and stuff like that. But in Bangladesh, for example, the JICA has taken over a port that they are building. So Japan is building a deep sea port in Bangladesh. It's on its second phase already. Whereas China was not allowed to build the Sonadia port, which shows that there again is a power rivalry in that sector. Interestingly, in about 2017-18, if I'm not wrong, China's stock exchange, a consortium of stock exchange, managed to get about 25% stakes in Bangladesh's largest stock exchange. And the only other party that was bidding was a consortium of India's National Stock Exchange and US's NASDAQ. So evidently, there is a attempt to counter China by coming together, by creating a bloc, which, however, I would argue will not be divided along clear lines for the very reason that the games are changing, interconnections are multi-layered, and the fact that the mode of the game is now also changing. I think with this, I would just wind up, and I would hope that there will be questions on this front. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Surabna. Let's move to Dr. Munis Thorangbang. Munis, you have 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Pramod, for giving me this opportunity. And I also welcome my co-panelists, Dr. Bing and Dr. Wen Lau and Ms. Barua. Much has been covered, regarding the conceptual clarity of the geopolitical rivalry in this two particular security complex, if I may use of regional security complexes. And what Ms. Barwa did by, again, pointing out Myanmar was to really sort of like, throw open the idea of insular states or the connecting sort of states in two different security complexes. To take from previous presentations, I think the names like Indo-Pacific has been mentioned, ASEAN has been dealt with very, very comprehensively by Dr. Bing, and I think SAARC was also touched upon by Ms. Barua. And I think these are really interesting dynamics about what Dr. Bing mentioned at the end, which was talking of the future of intra-regionalism versus inter-regionalism, and also to talk about different other permutation of institutions that reflect some sort of trans-regionalism. So I think these are fairly interesting points to sort of give our minds to when we think of geopolitical rivalry involving also extra-regional powers in certain regions, whether it is Southeast Asia, as we are seeing in the South China Sea, or whether it's in South Asia, again, involving the similar kind of players, which have been having a history of involvement in this particular region. So that brings me to my first proposition about geopolitical rivalry in South Asia, which is to look at both history and geography. I think these 2 points are fairly important in terms of understanding what is really playing out in South Asia, and it's a I think it's an important time to talk about it while my country is engaged with China for some time, in the Galwan Valley in the Ladakh region, and there's talks going on right now as we talk about it, about the future of that and the disengagement of troops and how we are going to handle such situations in the future. So I think history and geography has a lot of role to play. The colonial context in this region, you might stretch it up to Southeast Asia and also to Central Asia, and then look at this larger region which involves these 2 particular regions that we are talking about, and who are the players involved in this. So to talk about again what was referred to as Great Games, you look at how the British were sort of like using Myanmar and the northeastern part of India as station grounds to make sure that they could keep up French, because the French were the colonial masters in Indochina. And also the Great Game was being played on the western side in terms of keeping out the Russians from Afghanistan. So, when you look at this region and the kind of geopolitical rivalry which is playing out in this region, what you really see is contested boundaries and contested histories among different players in the region. And with that, you sort of involve like players which are foreign and extra-regional, and what kind of strategic objectives they have in this region, and how do those strategic objectives have changed over the years. So, in this region, you also have fairly long, ancient cultural entities and identities, which became, new state boundaries or new state entities in the 20th century, right? You often talk about India as an ancient civilization, China as a civilizational state, and then many of the Southeast Asian small kingdoms as having existed in different entities for a very long period of time. And you suddenly see the phase of decolonization and redrawing of political boundaries in the region, and then giving rise to unresolved territorial disputes, giving rise to unresolved understandings of porosity of borders, and giving rise to dynamic terms of engagement between this, long, natural cultural neighbors, which suddenly had to come to terms with new political conceptions and Westphalian state boundaries, which were a part of the 20th century, political order that was being built in the face of decolonization. So when you look at these borders, for instance, Nepal was mentioned. You have the LOC, line of control between India and Pakistan. You have contested boundaries between India and China, line of actual control stretching up from the north into the northeast. And what you see is that some of these contested or open borders may be more militarized, some may be less militarized, some might be more trade-oriented and economic-oriented, some might see more people-to-people context in terms of the porosity of the borders. You stand in Siliguri at any point of time and you look towards 3 sides of Siliguri and you see that, you travel down one road, you touch Bhutan, you travel down one road, you touch Nepal, you travel down one road, you touch, so I think Bangladesh. Right? So it's a very complex region in that sense, and you are bound to have this kind of differences from time to time. So the question is, how much of it is militarized? For example, the India-China border is certainly militarized. The India-Pakistan border is certainly militarized. So some of these borders are more militarized than others. Some of these borders are more volatile and prone to conflicts as compared to some other borders. So there is a difference in terms of how this geography has to be seen in terms of the new political boundaries that have been imagined and realized and conceptualized and implemented as national sovereignty boundaries, where when you reach a certain point in the territory, you say that my sovereignty ends here, and another country's sovereignty starts from this region. The problem is that in many of these areas, many of these ideas are from where sovereignty ends and another sovereignty starts seem, still more contested, and that certainly is a region for many of the things that we are seeing right now. Many American authors have tended to call this region as periphery in the Cold War. As a scholar, I sometimes contest that, in the sense that there are many other scholars, Indian scholars, who have seen, for example, as to how South Asia was very, very instrumental region in terms of the growth of US hegemony, and also the contest between Soviet, Sino-Soviet communism, which sort of broke down in the late 60s with the Sino-Soviet split, leading to a very different kind of regional sort of politics. So it remains a question, how central was this region in the Cold War and also in the post-Cold War era, and the new great power emerged in this region, certainly with the rise of China and the kind of lateral expansion that you see in China. It's as was fairly mentioned in previous thing. What the problem for India, looking at from an Indian perspective, certainly is not the Indian perspective. What I'm providing is an Indian perspective. So there's a difference between the two. So I think when you look at it from India, I think the problem is, it's not just enough to say that, Belt and Road Initiative is bad, or it's not good for other countries. The problem for us is, how able we are to provide alternatives in terms of both connectivity projects and development assistance and other things, and who are our partners going to be in that process of providing alternatives. Japan was mentioned. America's Blue Dot Network is sort of rising in the horizon. There's not much of specificity being provided right now. Japan certainly is involved a lot in the northeast region of India as well, in building a lot of infrastructure projects and other things as a part of India's ACIS policy. So I think the problem for India in this is, what are the alternatives? And what can India do not to compete with China? I think the main issue for us to look at geopolitical rivalry in this region also is to look at the problem of power asymmetry or power imbalance. We are facing a country which is roughly like $12 trillion economy. It's the second largest economy in the world. So it's mostly like at least four times bigger than the Indian economy. So the kind of things that China will be able to provide certainly would be different from the kind of things that India will be willing and able to provide. So I think the road ahead is in terms of like what we can do, sort of like, in a grand strategy fashion, aligning your aspirations and your capability. Your aspirations has to be aligned with your capabilities. And how do you increase those capabilities, and what are the partners that you are choosing, and what is the cost that you are going to pay for choosing those partners? And I think that's very important, because at the end, international relations is transactional. There's no charity in international relations. You give and take. So when you give and take with other countries in terms of improving and promoting your interests in a particular region, you got to ask yourself, what am I going to pay for this, right? Can I incur that cost? So there is a cost to be paid for great power relations. That's one thing that I want to sort of look at. And the other proposition that I want to put forth is, when you look at geopolitical rivalry in South Asia, you got to also look at how the great power rivalry between US-China we are talking about now impacts local balances of power and local rivalries. Because when you look at security complexes, a security complex is also known by persistent local rivalries, persistent regional rivalries. You have one with India and Pakistan. If you extend South Asia and look at it as Southern Asia and include China into the whole mix, you have another contested boundary and a local sort of a rivalry. The point is that that local rivalry is with one of the biggest countries one of the most powerful countries in the world right now, which is China. And you, of course, have the China-Pakistan nexus that we we sort of keep talking about in India, and you look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor on the Trans-Karakoram track, and the kind of investment that China is sort of putting down, and that's a big concern for someone looking from India in terms of what it means for India's promotion and protection of interests in the whole region. When you look at this region, you see this one particular triangle which is there, which is the India-Pakistan-Afghanistan triangle. And you have the US, which has been involved in Afghanistan for a very long time, plus 18 years of military engagement, and it's come to a point where it needs a face-saving exit. The US in the Trump administration has fairly redefined military victory in Afghanistan by saying that, well, the point is like we need to redefine victory. And the point is not of winning, but the point is how to avoid losing in Afghanistan. And I think that's the strategy that has really sort of driven American thinking in the past events. And when you look at the signing of the so-called peace deal between the Taliban and the USA without involving the Afghan government, and the torturous and the treacherous intra-Afghan talks that involves the Afghan government and certain other groups and the Taliban, which has not been really going well. And in all of that mix, you got to also ask the question that what is the role of Pakistan in this? What's the role of Pakistan in this in trying to bring the Chinese into the whole game of Afghanistan? And what does it mean for India? I have argued in many of my articles that time sort of for India to think and rethink about talking to the Taliban, because we have had a principled stand on not talking to the Taliban for a very long time. And I think that has run out of its time. And I think, this is something that has to be thought. It's a difficult debate in New Delhi, a difficult debate in India, but I think that is something that we have to deal with heads on. The other country which is sort of interesting is also, you can see it in form a trilateral, which is India, China, Bhutan trilateral, because we already have seen a conflict in 2017 at the Doklam, which is the tri-junction of India, Bhutan, and China. And much of this conflicts revolve around the developments in terms of border infrastructure building. And for India, it's important to look out to Bhutan, and I would submit not to take Bhutan for granted. It's nice to say Bhutan has been a steadfast friend of India, is the only South Asian country which did not go to the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. That's all fine. But there are already sort of like reports of the Bhutanese sort of talking to the Chinese in terms of a resolution of their own border dispute. There's already been an amendment, for example, to the India-Bhutan Treaty, which was seen as something where India was given the responsibility of supervising Bhutan's foreign policy. That has gone for a change. Bhutan has gone for a democratic transition, and Bhutan having gone for democratic transition, I think it's not a given that it is good for India. You have to take it with a pinch of salt and say where is Bhutan really going? How is Bhutan going to, as Dr. Van Lau said about small powers playing great power politics, how is Bhutan going to play great power politics? And how is India going to make sure that in Bhutan playing that great power politics, India does not lose out the one friend that we call in South Asia? So I think this triangle is fairly sort of important to look out for. And at the end, what really determines great power rivalry in South Asia is mutual threat perceptions, relative national powers. Powers are always relative and relational. You're always comparing powers. Relative national powers. Pakistan vis-a-vis India, India vis-a-vis China, India vis-a-vis all the other smaller South Asian countries in South Asia. What responses and counter responses are you going to get because of this mutual threat perceptions and relative national powers? And what does it mean to have distant great power and approximate great power? China remains a proximate great power. US is a distant great power. Uncle Sam can say, hello, bye-bye, I'm pulling out from Indo-Pacific. What do you do then? So I think, these are important things to consider in terms of like when we're looking at the future. And I think both in the maritime and the continental space, it's fairly important to think through what are going to be the primary theaters of contestation, conflict, cooperation in the region, and which areas are going to be more conflictual and more conflict prone in the times to come. And in my final submission, I would say that when you look at geopolitical rivalry in South Asia and South Asia as a security complex, I see the problems in South Asia is going to be something that has to be managed rather than something which can be eliminated. So that's my final submission. Thank you very
much. Thank you, Munis. We have got lots of questions, so I think we'll rush to the questions. Let me start with the first four set of questions. And some of the questions are directly addressed to the speaker, some are to more than one, or maybe it's left random. So I'll start in the same order. But before that, I have 4 questions. I want all our speakers to note down the questions, or you can ask us. First is for Surabna and Munis. What do you think will be India's role in the geopolitics of Southeast Asia? The role of India in geopolitics of Southeast Asia is for, maybe either one of you can answer or both of you can answer. Second is for Dr. Taubin or maybe Dr. Ban Loy, they can answer. What is the prospects and status of BRI project in Southeast Asia? What is the prospects of BRI project and what is the status of BRI project in Southeast Asia? One is not addressed to anyone, so anyone can answer. What is Russia's role in the balance of power in South and Southeast Asia? So it's a mix of both. Anyone can address the role of Russia in balancing the power. Fourth and the last for this round is for Dr. Taubin and Dr. Ban Loy. How are ASEAN members positioning themselves in this geopolitical rivalry? How they are adjusting to this geopolitical rivalry? So maybe we're going to start with Dr. Taubin, and then maybe he can respond first. Please unmute yourself.
All right, you can hear me. All right, thank you. First of all, again, I would like to thank my fellow panelists for also having given a very good presentation of their thoughts and views, and I think it's very illuminating about the competition in South and Southeast Asia, and which I have learned a lot. Right, thank you. To answer the questions, I think the questions basically first is about the prospect of BRI in Southeast Asia and how these projects will turn out to be. Well, I think actually, first of all, I can speak for Southeast Asian country. Southeast Asia, ASEAN is 10 members, each with their own thinking and their own pro and cons of their BRI projects. And a lot of whether the projects will turn out to be successful or not, sometimes is determined more by the local factors rather than some kind of systemic factors. But I don't deny there are some patterns, some common factors, but I think whether they turn out to be successful or not, a lot more is actually based on how the local political, economic elite, civil society, all of that negotiate and agree, and how China negotiate and agree to some kind of deals that all parties find it acceptable and move on. In the case of Malaysia, there are a number of BRI projects. I think the more controversial one is called the ECRL. I'm not sure friends outside of Malaysia have heard of it, but it's a big issue is here in Malaysia. It has been on and off, negotiated, renegotiated, and the news is that currently the new government is thinking about to renegotiate again. Whether it's a success or not, actually, I think we have to think about the time factors. Many of these projects will not be completed in years, and even if they are completed, their impacts will not be felt in years or so. So it's really, I think, too early to say whether BRI projects in Southeast Asia is a success or is a failure. I think it's just basically too early to tell. And the whole picture is just too diverse to say which one is failure or not. I think the second question is about Russia's role in Southeast Asia. I'm not a Russia expert. I'm more focusing on China, but perhaps I can just provide some views. Russia basically wants, it's just a hint, wants to play a bigger role, but it's always going to remain its secondary marginal area of operation in terms of diplomatic security and so on and so forth. It's not a primary area, but what Russia is very good at is to exploit the opportunities for their own benefits. It's not blaming them. I mean, it's just a very normal way for them to behave. So they are providing basically a lot of arms. They are selling a lot of weapons in the region. And there are oil contractors. They are basically their oil giant companies are also trying to explore the contracts here in the region. And these are all opportunities provided by the fault lines that are emerging in the disputes and other issues, right? But I think Russia will be here, will watch carefully, will observe, but they will not stick their head out and try to dominate the agenda here. All right, that is based on my observation. And the third is how ASEAN members seeing this. Again, this is something that I think really difficult to answer, because ASEAN is sometimes come together in a one group, seem very effective and united. In a way it is, but on the other hand, it's a very dialectical in the sense that all ASEAN members think about their own way, and ASEAN is more diverse sometimes than how outsiders think it is. There is no really common civilizational foundation for the 10 ASEAN members. You got the Buddhists, you know, the Thai and the Myanmaris. You got the Catholic Philippines. You got the Muslim countries. You got the Confucian influence country, and then you have from Vietnamese communists to the Brunei, which is a absolute monarchy. So it's actually the political diversity, the civilizational diversity of ASEAN is really huge, and many of them really perceive the rivalry in a very different way. Some see this as an opportunity. Some see
of geopolitical competition between the United States and China, we can see that during the pandemic and even prior to the pandemic, with the launching of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's political and economic influence in Southeast Asia has in fact grown a lot compared with the United States. But at the same time, there is an irony that distrust about China is also growing. So that's the irony about the situation. And when we have this kind of difficult moment in the security of Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, particularly the Philippines, has the tendency to welcome the United States to act some more in order to balance the influence of China. And based on the current survey in the Philippines, the trust of Filipinos towards the United States remains very high, and then followed by Japan. And trust rating towards China remains very low. So while the economic and political influence of China is also growing in the Philippines, it is ironically that distrust is also growing towards China. And when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, this is the data I gathered as of the end of 2019. There were more than 40 Chinese enterprises that invested in the Philippines as a result of President Duterte's support to the Belt and Road Initiative. And this directly employed close to 20,000 workers and generated around 26,000 jobs. In fact, the Philippine government under President Duterte is now implementing what it's called the Build, Build, Build project, part of its infrastructure plan for the Philippines. And under the Belt in BRI project of China, China has promised to fund at least 75 projects under Duterte's Build, Build, Build plan. And out of these 75 projects, at least 10 major projects of the BBB are expected to be funded under the Belt and Road Initiative. But unfortunately, the pandemic is slowing down the process of the implementation of this financing arrangement. But the Philippines continues to receive economic assistance from Beijing, especially in the time of the pandemic, that we receive a lot of assistance from China, because China has this tremendous interest to maintain and sustain the Philippines in the Belt and Road Initiative. And based on my coordination with the Chinese embassy, they are putting the Philippines in a category where the Belt and Road Initiative can be implemented. Out of, I think, 40% of China's Belt and Road Initiative in Asia has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, but 40% can still be sustained, and the remaining percent were not totally affected. And there is high optimism on the part of the Chinese government that the Philippines can still be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But because of the situation in the South China Sea, things are being affected. So there is now a very slow process in terms of actually extending the financial assistance intended for this infrastructure plan. And in fact, that is now the source of pushback on the part of the Philippines when it comes to China, because many of the big ticket projects to be funded under the BRI has not been approved, or it's not been approved, still under the feasibility status. Now, I would like to comment also about the role of Russia in Southeast Asia. I can speak on the part of the Philippines. Russia is in fact deliberately engaging the Philippines in many aspects of security cooperation. China is very much, Russia is very much involved now in building capacity of the Philippine government in countering terrorism, and also in Russia also wants to contribute in the military modernization program. Russia is offering its corvettes, its frigates, and even possible submarines to the Philippine government. So I can say that Philippine-Russia relations has improved a lot prior to the pandemic, and President Duterte even visited Russia in order to strengthen its relationship with Russia. And compared with the United States, President Duterte even declared that he trusts Russia and China more than the United States. So that's the situation right now. So in other words, when it comes to the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China, China's influence is growing and in Southeast Asia. And if China recovers from the pandemic and it will prove to be economically recovering in the pandemic, and this type of economic recovery will be extended to Southeast Asia, I think China's influence will grow more. But I think the main challenge to China is to address this trust deficit. So unless China addresses this trust deficit, then countries in Southeast Asia will still welcome the United States in order to balance the power of China. But when it comes to the United States, this is the major, I think, this is the major stand of the ASEAN countries. They want US presence, but I think many countries in Southeast Asia do not want US dominance. And I think that also applies with China. They want Chinese presence. In fact, Chinese presence in Southeast Asia is a de facto, is a given, because China is just right at the doorstep of Southeast Asian countries. But I think Southeast Asia does not want any dominant role of any major powers. And I think ASEAN will continue to engage all the major powers. And if you will look at the statement of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific outlook, ASEAN is still advancing for its centrality in the emerging security architecture in Southeast Asia. So the ASEAN centrality is still being pushed by the members of ASEAN, but the main challenge is maintaining ASEAN unity. That's all.
Thank you. Surabna?
Yeah, so I think a lot has been already spoken about ASEAN centrality. along the lines of my presentation, I would answer the question on ASEAN and India involvement in 2 points. The first point is that there is now a growing ASEAN connectivity project that is coming up. And in fact, Indonesia is one of the anchors of ASEAN centrality, has been trying to come up with more interconnectivity, whether it is in terms of more flights to Indonesia, whether it is in terms of connecting the islands of Andaman and Nicobar to its Aichi province, which to be remembered are very close. They are a few miles apart. Usually in India from New Delhi, there is a tendency to think of ACTIS only through the forget that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are very close to Indonesia, through which then India reaches out to ASEAN. So since Indonesia is playing a big role in terms of increasing those connectivity projects and bringing about ASEAN centrality, I think India can engage with ASEAN on that front and indirectly then play a role in the so-called great game that we have been talking about. Uh, uh, Having said that, I would underline that there is no comparison between India and China in terms of investments, because China is definitely way ahead of India in its amount of investments. Yet, among the ASEAN countries, there's a report that Indonesia is one of the countries with the largest infrastructure gap, and that gap is being filled by China. More recently, Indonesia has given some red signals to China in terms of investments. But despite that, I think what India has to do is see in its own way, like some of my co-panelists have pointed out, it's not about just competing and fighting and rivalry, but how we could actually, India could actually engage with countries in ASEAN, with Philippines, with Indonesia and other countries through this multilateral forum. And along those lines, again, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia are all working to build this connectivity. The issue of connectivity, Indonesia, for example, has led the global maritime fulcrum, because maritime, as we all know, is becoming a big aspect, and this is one area where China is trying to make its forays. And also there was a report very recently in about 2017, then backed by many other reports, stating that by 2050, China is going to be the largest economy with the biggest GDP of 60 plus trillion, followed by India with a GDP of about 42 trillion, then the US, and the fourth country would be Indonesia with about 12 something trillion. So we have to remember that even these countries, that are the 10 countries that are part of ASEAN, are all crucial players in this engagement game. And in my opinion, it is by connecting, creating better linkages with them, whether it is to do with connectivity or economic or any other way that we have to move forward. The other point I wanted to mention is a little beyond ASEAN. So ASEAN plus 6, and the big picture we have is this whole RCEP factor. Now, India has refused to be pushed by China to sign the RCEP agreement. And I think it has a lot to do with India's trade in services point, that the fact that China is the biggest manufacturer and is the biggest trader of goods, whereas India is not. India is one of the biggest in terms of services. And until that point is being factored in into the agreement, I think India is right in a way, whether you call it a game that they're playing, whether you call it its own way of negotiating. I think that's an important point that we can look at when we are engaging with ASEAN plus the 6 countries. So these are the 2 points just to answer one of the questions on ASEAN and India. The second question, again, something that has already been answered about Russia's involvement. Just to add a point, that I feel that since President Donald Trump volunteered to negotiate or help China and India talk among themselves so that the border dispute is not aggravated, I think Russia also wanted to come in at that point of time. In fact, recently we had the RIC virtual summit. So I think Russia provided that field for China and India to talk at a time when none of the officials were in talking terms. So that is a part of Russia playing in diplomacy within that great game, is what I would say. Thank you.
Munis,
Yeah,
your
very
comments?
quickly, because a lot has been covered already. Regarding India's role in the geopolitics of Southeast Asia, I will take up from what Dr. Bing and Dr. Vian Lau has said. First of all, referring to what Dr. Bing referred to, each of the 10 Southeast Asian countries sort of being different in their priorities in some ways. I think what is evolved over the period of time is India's own creation and recreation of terms of engagement with the institution of ASEAN as such, and also with the individual countries in a bilateral sense. Because you see that some of the engagements are fairly economic oriented, and some of them are military oriented. For example, with Vietnam, wherein the Russian-Indian built BrahMos missile, the cruise missile, is being negotiated for a very long time in terms of Vietnam being a, India being a supplier. Singapore is quite different. With Myanmar is quite different in the sense that it has been both border trade as well as counter-insurgency in India. If you look at the fact that very recently, even during COVID-19, 22 insurgents of Indian origin who were camping in certain parts of the Shangang division of Myanmar were transported back to India after an operation done by Tatmadaw, the Myanmarese military. So I think that is one thing that we have to keep in mind, that it's going in different ways. The other thing I would pick up from what Dr. Vian Lau has said about saying that the material influence of China is huge in Southeast Asia, but there's a trust deficit. I think it's the other way around with India, because the trust issue is a little better for India, but the material influence is still lower for India. So I think we have to factor that in mind, in the sense that how do we play upon, or how do we use that trust influence more vigorously in terms of translating them into tangible results on the ground as far as projects and other kind of developments are concerned. In terms of priorities, I think also we need to figure out what are the priority areas, in the sense that there has been a lot of commentary on India in terms of the Indian Navy sort of like doing more with the Americans in the Western Pacific, whether patrolling or other things. The Indians have been a little cautious with that. They have not gone beyond constabulary role in the Western Pacific, if you see the Indian military maritime strategy. So I think what is the sense of this sense of free and open Indo-Pacific? I think for the Americans is a lot more confrontational, in the sense that their understanding of the free and open Indo-Pacific is more of freedom of navigation operations for the American Navy, vis-a-vis the sea control and sea denial strategies of the Chinese. And how do we sort of bring in Southeast Asian countries like that? So the second question, so that's the first one. The second question about Russia. Whoever is speaking, can you please mute your mic? Okay. The second question about Russia. I think one thing from an Indian's perspective that I've always sort of believed in, and I've argued, is that Russia is not the Soviet Union. So Indians cannot harp on a romanticization of a Soviet USSR India relationship, which is time tested and like always going to be there, because dynamics are changing. You have a Russia China understanding which is very different from how it was during the Cold War. Nevertheless, I'm not saying that strategic alliance between the Russians and the Chinese are also time tested. You have differences which are going to crop up with Chinese migration into the Russian Far East, which is very close to a very populated area of China. You are going to have differences. For example, you need to, I would urge you to read, the former National Security Advisor John Bolton's new controversial book, on the Trump administration. And what came out very interesting was that on the open, when Trump walk out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty. The Russians and the Americans were blaming each other for walking out of the treaty. But I feel that the target was China, because their argument was that the INF Treaty was constraining Russians and Americans from new developments in missile technologies, while the Chinese were not a part of it. So they were more free to be developing more on IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles. So both of them sort of like coming to these terms that the INF Treaty needs to be done away with. I think it's not much about Russia and US, but it is more about the Russians and Americans being concerned about Chinese developments in missile technology. So you see this, sort of dynamics playing out where the Russians are also becoming more important, for example, from an Indian point of view, in terms of not only being our defense supplier, but also how Russia is injecting itself into the Indo-Pacific. Because you had a Vladivostok summit, and more than that, you have climate change sort of affecting the sea arteries in the Arctic region. If that ice melting, which has already happened, and if that continues and it frees the Arctic region, that is going to dramatically change the nature of what we talk about Indo-Pacific, and that will bring Russia right into the middle of the Indo-Pacific debate. So I think it will be naive to sort of like rule out Russia from whatever is happening. Thank you.
Let me move to the next round of questions. First is the role of China in Southeast Asia. What role does it play? I think our panelists from Southeast Asia can respond. Second is, what is the role of China in both regions? I mean, it's like another question is also very similar, the role of China in South Asia and Southeast Asia. I think it was also covered in the presentation, but maybe you can briefly respond to it. Second is, what is stopping the ASEAN countries from coming up with ASEAN -X, formulating to work out a legal binding code of conduct in ASEAN that could better address China's aggression in the region? Another question is, India and Australia have recently signed agreements to use each other's military base, and it did sign similar agreement with the United States a few years back for reciprocal use of bases as Quad members and party to Indo-Pacific strategy. It is unlikely that India's use of US or Australian bases, instead they will have a chance of using Indian base during the rift with China. So how India takes this arrangement that may bring out rivalry in South Asia region, aggravated original instability. So this might be, maybe Munis can respond. The other question may be for our Southeast Asian speakers. And the last is, how has Southeast countries got benefited from Europe in Asia Pacific? Maybe we can again start with Dr. Taubin. Please unmute yourself.
All right, thank you for the questions again. I think I get, if I'm correct, two. One is what is the role of China in Southeast Asia, and the second part is about the code of conduct, the so-called ASEAN minus mechanism. I'm not sure if I get there are other questions for the Southeast Asians. If I miss any, I'm sorry. All right, about the
yes, the last question is, how has Southeast Asia benefited from Europe in Asia Pacific? I mean, how they have benefited from US and Europe?
Europe and US. All right. Okay. In the Indo-Pacific. All right. Okay. I think the first one is China's role. Again, I think the question is too general. The roles are different in 10 countries, different in different regions, and different in terms of the whole organization, ASEAN. China's plays a different kind of role, right? So, and then Southeast Asia, there are 10 countries, but there is the Indo-China continental part, and then there is the maritime part, in which China also play different role. And then, of course, in different countries. So, and in all levels, whether it's ASEAN, the regions, sub-regions, or the individual countries, China come in different aspects in terms of security, in terms of economics. Of course, economics is a very major components. and in terms of cultural influence, right? And it could be positive and negative in different ways, right? So let me just give you give an example. Like China's military to military relations with Thailand is excellent and stretched back all the time to the 1980s, despite Thailand being an ally of the United States. But this has not happened in many other Southeast Asian countries. So in that sense, you can see how diverse the role of China could be. So the question is, I think, a bit too general for me to answer specifically what the question is about. The second is about the code of conduct, whether there should be a ASEAN minus mechanism, and this has been talked about for I think actually quite some time already. Among the think tanks and certain policymakers have thought about it. But I think one problem is that if you have ASEAN minus, you are effectively basically breaking ASEAN into two groups. Yes, the ASEAN minus may be more effective, but those countries that get minus out, what would they think? They think that we are being sidelined by other ASEAN members, and therefore they will actually even be more prone to, in this case, I suppose China, right? So ineffectively, it risks the what I actually just now mentioned, the hollowing out of ASEAN, right? The internal disunity of ASEAN. So there is this risk that ASEAN minus mechanism will create. And therefore, this is a very huge risk, and therefore is still not moving towards that path yet. Finally, Europe and US. I think Europe, well, US, we have already talked a lot about US. I think it's back to maybe just mention a little bit about Europe. And if you talk about Europe, it's basically just a few European countries. And then the British still maintain quite a strong presence here. The French is actually a Pacific countries because of some of the its possessions in the Pacific. And all these countries basically want to affirm certain universal principles, the freedom of navigation and so on and so forth in terms of Indo-Pacific. And some of them, and in particular the British, after Brexit, they are looking towards other parts of the world again to make themselves a relevant actor. So, all right, sorry. So in that sense, Britain has become much more active, and in terms of partnering, especially with the US. However, I think so far the EU will be an important, European countries will be important economic-wise. In terms, even in terms of security, they continue to sell some arms, all right? But they will not again be the principal actors. The main actors will still be China, US, Japan will still be very important, followed by the secondary set of actors that will be Russia, India actually, and also European countries. But Australia will be a major part of it. I think this will be the major so-called external actors. I think there will be the two layers of them. Right. I think that will be my questions, my answers to the questions. Thank you.
Dr. Ben Loy, maybe you'd like to respond.
Yes, thank you. If you will base the responses of ASEAN members on their documents found in the ASEAN Regional Forum Asia-Pacific Security Outlook, there is a consensus among countries in Southeast Asia that China will play a very vital role in the security and stability of Southeast Asia. And therefore, it is very, very essential for countries in Southeast Asia to promote cooperation with China, because without China's cooperation in the peace and stability of Southeast Asia, the region will be in trouble. So that's the consensus, if you will read the outlook of Southeast Asian countries when it comes to the role of China. But of course, there is a real politic here. When you talk about Southeast Asia, there are two Southeast Asias that we have to consider. We have the mainland Southeast Asia, which is very much pro-China, and we have the maritime Southeast Asia that is what we call the with issues with China. Mainland Southeast Asia, we have Myanmar and Laos and Cambodia, and to a certain extent Thailand. They have a very, very close relationship with China, but in the maritime Southeast Asia, we have issues. And these issues are in fact pertaining to the South China Sea issue. So when it comes to the code of conduct in the South China Sea, in my reading of my interactions with all the players in ASA, and also based on my monitoring of the bilateral consultative mechanism on the South China Sea, there is now growing pessimism from China on the need to have a code of conduct in the South China Sea, because of the two major issues that are being debated. Number one, players are still debating on the scope of the code of conduct, and even the status of the code of conduct, on whether the code of conduct will be legally binding or not. There is a consensus among ASEANs that if we conclude a code of conduct, it must be legally binding, but that's not being talked about by China. And even the scope, there are countries in Southeast Asia who says that the scope of the code of conduct should only be in the sprat list because that's multilateral, because the issue of Paracel only belongs to China and Vietnam, and the Scarborough Shoal is only between China and the Philippines. So there are still issues, and if you will look at the single draft issue, Indonesia is saying that we cannot pursue with the discussions on the code of conduct digitally. They want a face-to-face discussions on that. But other countries are still saying that we can do something during the pandemic in order to push that. But I think my reading of China is that under the leadership of Vietnam, I think China is not very optimistic about the discussion on the code of conduct. And I think China will buy time to maybe next year to have another chairmanship in order to push through with that. And that is why there's now a move towards what we call the ASEAN minus participants, because of the disagreements among Southeast Asian countries regarding the prospect for the code of conduct. But on the part of the Philippines and Vietnam, we are now talking with each other in order to really push forward the discussion on the code of conduct, because the code of conduct in the South China Sea is really needed in order to have a rules-based regime in the South China Sea. And on the part of the Philippine government, the code of conduct will not solve the dispute, but I think the code of conduct has great potential in terms of preventing potential armed conflicts in the South China Sea, or even promoting avoidance of conflict and promoting functional cooperation in the South China Sea, especially those areas identified by the declaration of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. There are 5 areas where countries in Southeast Asia can cooperate, and we need a Code of Conduct for the cooperation to happen. Cooperation in environmental marine protection, cooperation in joint fishery resources, and cooperation to combat transnational crimes and maritime piracy in the South China Sea. And most importantly, the need for cooperation and a rules-based regime in the safety of navigation and communication in the South China Sea. And that is why we are pushing for the code of conduct. But unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong in my reading that China is not becoming optimistic. You know, it's becoming pessimistic right now when it comes to the discussion of the code of conduct. But when it comes to European Union, I think the European Union is now being sidelined right now, because the 2 superpowers are at the center of discussion right now. And on the part of the United States, I think the United States will continuously reassert its leadership in Asia. And if you're familiar with the document published by the Republican Party, it now specifically identifies China as the main threat to American security interests in the world, and that will resonate in the region. And if there's any European power that is very much present in the region, particularly in South China Sea. I agree with Peter, that the French is the most visible European country. But when it comes to economic and political influence, I think European Union needs to exert more effort to make their presence felt in Southeast Asia. So that's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Surabna, would you like to make any comments? Surabna? Or maybe Munis, because I have no question for her. Munis?
Yes, sorry. I would just like to make one short comment on the question about India and Australia. I think the most evident and the talked about point was about how Australia was demanding an inquiry into where the virus originated and so on and so forth, which led to this jargon of wolf warrior diplomacy, and that all of us got talking about. But beyond that, I think the impacts that this had was for both China as well as India were very stark. They were very different. Firstly, I think China threatened Australia with economic coercion. If I'm not mistaken, there was a news about tariffs being increased on their imports of barley and so on and so forth, which meant that they were not just making talks, they were ready to take action just for the fact that there was an inquiry going to be set up in terms of where the virus originated from. This question about whether the spread of COVID again is a part of the great game. I hope not, because that would be a terrible game in that sense. But there was talk about how the wet markets of Wuhan being the point where the virus originated from. China made some claims about how there was a contingent from the USA which visited the market during the same time, that is last year, October, November. And because of that, it is the US which was playing a game about then spreading the virus. These are again, they weren't really followed up, and I think there are going to be many conspiracy theories along those lines. But another point is that at the same time, after this incident, Australia and India went ahead to sign a joint venture in terms of shared vision for the maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. They also spoke about their upgraded comprehensive strategic partnership. So the way just after this COVID pandemic hit, I think the way Australia reacted to China and to India became very stark. And that is something that India has and could take advantage of in terms of trying to build more cooperation, whether it's in response to countering China or not, we will have to see. I think in terms of the way China has handled the whole situation diplomatically, India has written, in fact, our former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale had mentioned in one of the articles from his experiences how Chinese diplomats, unlike in the last couple of decades or from the times of Deng Xiaoping and all, that they have become more aggressive even on the negotiating table. And this is something that we have also witnessed when it came to this incident, about from where this whole term of wolf war, warrior diplomacy came up. So I think just on that point about Australia, the fact that China has reacted very sharply, and the fact that Australia has been quick to respond to China and India very differently is something that we all have observed. Thank you.
Munis?
What can I go on that? Okay, I'll pick up from what Ms. Barwa has just mentioned. She's rather provided a rationale for the COVID-19 sort of like, pushing Australia a little more towards India. And that's certainly one rationale that we can look at. If I remember well, one part of the question was also some kind of a concern of Indian bases being, used in the future, and all these interoperability agreements which are being signed, also between the US and India, which is really at the heart of the matter, because I think, as Chinese aggressiveness sort of like increases and it sort of pushes other countries to the corner, especially the Quad countries, it was only a matter of time that Australia and India was going to go ahead more in terms of doing more. Regarding the American thing, it is being referred, the agreement that is being referred to in the question is the LEMOA agreement, which is the Logistics Support Agreement, which was previously called as LSA. Let me remind you that this agreement, apart from other foundational agreements like CONCASA and others, BECA is still in the discussions between India and US. CONCASA relates to technology transfers and technology, certain mandatory requirements for including technology in defense supplies that are coming from the US, including transport planes like C-17 Hercules. The LSA or the LEMAO is the one wherein India and the US develops some kind of an interoperability agreement whereby each other's bases are going to be used for replenishment of supplies. So they're not military in nature as of now. Who knows about the future? But as of now, they are more oriented towards HADR activities, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations. The nature of the agreement is such, and why it took 10 long years for India to negotiate that with the Americans, is that it is on a case-to-case basis. So it's not a wholesale interoperability agreement, but it's on a case-to-case basis, which allows both the countries, mostly American bases, for example, in the Pacific. So it allows both the countries to be able to use each other bases after notification on a case-to-case basis. And that's one of the reasons why it took 10 long years to negotiate, that it was not supposed to be a wholesale agreement. This agreement is very similar to other agreements which are signed by the Americans with its NATO partners. So certain specifications were to be done as to suit Indian interests. And so let me assure that this is not like the Americans can come in or Indians can go in and use each other bases every now and then. It's a case-to-case basis, and as of now, it is just meant for replenishment of logistics and supplies. And it is fairly important to know that it is such supplies replenishments are important when you look at the Indian Navy's new strategy components like the mission-based deployment, wherein the Indian Navy, if they go towards a certain region in the oceans, they need supplies every now and then. So it's a part of the mission-based deployment. So it's what one American strategist has fairly effectively described as being similar to the mobile battery and the charger that you carry with it, power bank. That's the word, the power bank, right? The power bank helps you charge the mobile, but then even the power bank has to be recharged every now and then in order to be able to charge the mobile. So this, when naval ships go in for long hauls in mission-based deployment in the oceans, every now and then, like a power bank, they also need to be recharged. So I think that's a fair analogy of what the Americans and Indians have been trying to do. As I said, will it get a more militarized nature in the future? I can't comment on that. But having said that, we need to remember that the Americans and the Indians, Ms. Barwa mentioned about the economic side of the Andaman and Nicobar Island and its closeness to Indonesia. The military side of is that we have the first Tri-Services Command in the Andaman and Nicobar Island. India and the US has conducted the first Tri-Service military exercise together. The P-8 Poseidon aircraft, which are long-range patrol aircraft, which helps in maritime domain awareness, is an American-made plane. And the Americans and Indians have been working very closely on anti-submarine warfare capabilities. And let's remember that the Tri-Service Command in the Andaman and Nicobar is fairly also close to the Malacca Straits. So if you look at subsurface vessels in the ocean, at some point of time near the choke points, they have to resurface. And that's the best region to be eavesdropping and then collecting intelligence, for example, on Chinese submarines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so but still we have lots of questions. So I think we'll end it here because there are almost like 20 more questions, and I don't know like whether we can go for the next round or not. So I'll end it here. Maybe you can have this kind of dialogue in series. So thank you everyone for your excellent presentation. It was very comprehensive discussion, and I'm sure all of us have learned a lot. We'd like to especially thank Director of ICS, Malaya University, Dr. Nigo Taubin. And I think our engagement does not end here, rather it's a beginning. We wish to keep engaging with Institute of Chinese Studies, Malaya University, and we wish to expand it further to PS, ISS, and organization represented by Dr. Romel Benloy, his Philippines Association for China Studies. All of us are young and energetic scholars, so we wish to have a longer academic engagement. This program would not have been possible without Dr. Peter. Peter was very kind, and he facilitated this program. So we would really like to thank him for all his effort. On behalf of NIICE and ICS Malaya University, I'd like to thank all our participants. Wish you a nice day, and please join us to our next event tomorrow. Thank you.